Thanks for tuning in. Hey everyone, welcome to the Renegade Craft Fair's virtual fair that I'm participating in for the weekend, and I'm so glad that you all are here. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to carve one of my botanical leaf planters. It's one of my favorite designs. It is porcelain slip painted onto a speckled stoneware that I've carved the lines into. So we'll be getting into that, but I thought I would just start off by sharing a little about myself and my products. So for anyone who's new, I learned ceramics back in college, but I didn't study ceramics. I just did it for fun on the side. And I got back into it a few years after college, and I really caught the bug at that point. And then I couldn't stop at that time. So then I did it for fun on the side, and then now for the last about 5 years I've been doing it as my profession. So that's just a little about me. All my work is actually slab built. I don't throw on the wheel. So that's a little bit different. I'm a hand builder. And I really am inspired by nature. The outdoors are a big source of inspiration for all of my work. So that really comes into play with this piece. It's not glazed. It has just a real natural feel to it that I really think brings a touch of the outdoors to the indoors. So that's a big part of everything I try and do. So let's see. We're gonna start out with, here's some pots that I made. I made them yesterday, and then today I smoothed them and put holes in for drainage. So these are ready to start painting on the porcelain slip. And you can see the difference. And this is where I started out, and this is the final product. So it's interesting to see how they shrink after they're fired. And I'll be painting on a porcelain slip to get started. So the carving technique that I do for this pot is called Sgraffito carving. And Sgraffito, it just means carving like through one layer of something, kind of exposing another layer beneath. So right now, this is just clay, and I'm gonna paint another layer on it so I have something to carve through. So this is just watered down porcelain that I keep, in a plastic jug to keep it wet, and I'm just gonna paint it on. I like these kind of hair long brushes for painting on the porcelain slip. So it's just watered down clay. And porcelain is a really smooth clay body, so when you have slip, it's just really smooth, just like painting. And I'm just gonna cover most of this pot with the porcelain slip. Let me move the camera down so you guys have a better view. So I made these pots yesterday so that they would be kind of a little bit dried out today. When I first make the pot, it's still really soft, and I like to let it dry for a little while and firm up before I go to this next step. When I paint on the porcelain slip, it's wet, so the piece will kind of absorb the water again. And I want it to be relatively dry when I actually go to carve. So So I'm actually going to need to paint on a few layers. As you can see, this is still kind of streaky when I put on my first layer. So I usually do 3 layers of the slip when I paint it on. And that's kind of a personal preference, how thick your slip is. But I like to paint it on until I don't see the streakiness anymore. And then I pause between the layers because it needs to dry a little before the next layers. There's a lot of little bits of waiting in ceramics while you wait for something to dry, or yeah, usually waiting for it to dry. So I have a few of these ready so I can do a couple. So how wet or dry your ceramics are is kind of a big factor in working with clay. When clay is really wet, you can mold it, smush it, push it around into whatever shape you want. As it dries, it gets more firm. And that's really good if you want to build something bigger. It might need to have some strength. Or when you carve, I find it's really nice for it to be a little bit harder, because you get a more crisp line when you go to carve a design. Let's see. I think I'll do 3 of these. I'm giving you some of the prep work. Thank you. Thank all you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. So here's just another first layer, so you can still see that it's pretty streaky. So now I'm going to move back to that first one that I did, and I can add another layer. Sometimes I'll actually put these out in front of a fan between layers so that they can dry a little bit. Because as I mentioned, it's nice to let them dry a little between layers, because the clay is absorbing the liquid from the slip as I paint it on. Here's that second one I worked on. So I actually have a batch of these that I painted the slip on yesterday, so that you don't necessarily have to watch me paint everything, and we can get down to the carving. But I did want to show you this part of the process. This is actually one of the only things that I do use porcelain for. I mostly build out of stoneware, but porcelain is really fun for painting on and carving. It's so smooth, it goes on like very nicely. Here's that third one. find the whole process of these planters to be kind of meditative to watch. So that's why I hoped it would be a good demonstration for this particular time. So I hope you all think so too. But if you do have any questions, feel free to write them, and I'll try and see if anyone has. So I'm gonna let those few that I was working on dry a little bit before I add another layer. These are, I made some the other day. I painted on the slip the other day so that it would be dry. So this is just what I was doing before, but this has 3 layers, and it's dried enough so that I can touch it and it's not gonna smudge or whatever. So as I was mentioning, clay has kind of different textures depending on how dry it is. So some people have given them different names, but some people might describe, like right now this clay is firm, but it's still cool and wet, but it's stiff. It's a little bit similar to, some people call it cheese hard or almost leather hard as kind of a description of how it should feel. It holds its shape now. It's not mushy anymore unless I were to really, really press on it. But like I mentioned, it still feels cool and it's still wet. So this is the ideal time for carving it for me. So I got these ready so they were kind of the right consistency, and I wrapped them up in plastic so they would be ready. So then now is when I like to carve them, but let me show you my tools before we get going. I like to use a loop tool, and a loop tool is kind of like it sounds. I'm going to be using a really small loop tool, but it's so little I didn't know if y'all would be able to see. So this is like an example of a larger loop tool. It's just a loop of wire, and this is like what you would use to trim a pot, but it allows, as you carve, for the clay to go through the loop and out the other side, and it helps you get kind of a crisp line. So loop tools are my favorite for carving, and they make all different kinds of sizes. Like this is a small one, but this like little itty bitty tiny wire on the end of here, this tiny little loop tool is my favorite for like delicate carving. And this is just a Kemper tool. Kemper is a company that makes clay carving and all kinds of tools. Kemper, Kemper. So this is my favorite right now. I have a few of them because I occasionally break them. That happened to me on another video I was making one time. I just broke the tool right in the middle. I was like, oops, okay, I guess that video's over. But let's get started. I'm gonna push this down so you can see a little better. I like to use either foam or I'm just using a sponge as something I can kind of rest it on, because my clay is pretty firm, but I don't want to hit it hard on anything because I could still like ding it. So it's nice to set it on something soft when I'm working, and I don't have to worry about making any blemishes. And yeah, and then I just free form the leaf planter. So hopefully you can get an idea that this loop tool carves a line, and that little bit of clay just comes out through the middle of the loop, and it gives a nice crisp line. I do this design freehand. I really love when I can add elements of my design that can just be done freehand, because I really enjoy when I can make work that is similar yet unique each time. even though I do a lot of designs that are repeated, I like when there's an element that causes those designs to be slightly different each time. I think that we've reached a point in our society where we can make a lot of things mass produced that are perfect, and they might be exactly the same. And I think now we've kind of swung back the other way, where it's really nice to appreciate the little differences that come along with something being handmade. If I'm going to take the time, because it does take extra time to make a lot of the work that I make, I want it to have those little unique characteristics. The leaves on each of these pots are not going to be exactly the same. And that's what I really love about it. Some of them are going to be leaning off to one side. Some of them are small, some of them are big. And that's what's fun about it. Okay, I had a question. Are you pressing down fairly hard with the tool, or is it more of a lighter touch? I guess this is probably my personality to say this, but it's kind of medium. It's not really hard. It's probably similar to writing with a pencil. Now that I haven't really thought about it before, but I would say it's similar to writing. It's not, you're not pressing really hard when you're writing. But it's not like a feather touch either. There is a little bit of pressure there. And that depends on how wet or dry your clay is. So I was kind of talking about that I have a preferred consistency of my clay for carving. But of course, you often don't get it exactly right. It's like there's a window. Your clay is really wet and mushy, and that's not really ideal for carving. But as it starts to get more firm, you can carve in it. Then as it gets drier, you can still carve, but it might be harder. You might have to press harder to get what you want. If it gets too dry, then you're kind of scratching at it, which you could still carve, but you might run a risk of accidentally pressing too hard then if it was really hard. But it's partly a personal preference, because there is like a window of, I find when I carve, when my clay is wetter, that I get just not a crisp line, but that might be a look that you're going for. When it comes to art, I really think there's not many right or wrong answers. It's more your preference. So for me, this is what I like to do. But if you liked, if you didn't want a crisp line, you could do it a different way, and that would be awesome. Let's see. Okay, so here are our leaves, and now I'm going to start doing the lines on the leaves. I usually do this the other way. Can you guys see okay? Hopefully. This is the part that I think is kind of the most satisfying and mesmerizing to just kind of stare at and watch. when I said earlier that I had broken one of these tools before, it's interesting that you asked like how hard I had to press. I don't think I broke the tool from pressing hard. This tool is just like a really thin wire on the end, and my clay is a little bit rough. This clay will turn into this speckled clay after it's fired, and it does have a little bit of grittiness to that clay. So over time your tool gets dull. So that's why they occasionally can break once you've used them for a while, not necessarily just from like pressing on it. I'm a plant lover, as you can kind of tell from this design and from and the fact that I make a lot of pottery for plants. I've shared before that growing up my favorite color was green. I've just always loved being outdoors, looking at plants and kind of exploring the forest floor. So now it's fun to kind of combine that with my pottery as well. Oh, let's see. Someone asked, when did I start adding the wall hangings to my products? I think, gosh, I don't remember exactly, but it was not right away. When I first got started, it was mostly planters. It might not have been until maybe my second year of selling. I've been making ceramics. Well, I said I learned ceramics mostly, like kind of my basics, back in college. That was more than 10 years ago now. And then it wasn't until a few years after that till I got back into clay. So because I had a few years off. And then I didn't start making ceramics to sell until about 5 years ago. And I think the wall hangings must have come like 3 or 4 years ago. I really just wanted something kind of decorative to hang on my wall. My favorite pieces of my own that I keep for my house are usually the decorative things. I kind of just like putting pretty fun things around my house, and they're almost always nature inspired. I like putting decorative things that give me a little taste of nature. So for me, the wall hangings are really about bringing in some of that natural clay feeling, which for me kind of connects me to the outdoors, but still in like a modern way. I don't like to be super realistic. So in my wall hangings, I use a lot of natural clay colors that are not glazed, and I think that gives a real earthy feel. And that's the same for this pot. This pot, I don't glaze it, and it'll just be raw clay when it's finished, so it doesn't have a sheen on it, and it kind of feels like the earth and looks like the earth a little bit, and that's kind of the inspiration for having those materials like that. But the longer that have been making the wall hangings, and I have a bunch of wall hangings hanging around my house. They're probably one of the things that I have kept the most of for myself lately. I also find them just like kind of peaceful to look at, and that wasn't necessarily like my intention when I went out to make them, but that's kind of what it's become for me. Can you guys see okay? Hello, thanks everyone who's tuning in. If you just joined, I am carving my botanical leaf planters. This technique is called Sgraffito. That's a fancy word for basically carving through one layer to kind of reveal a design through another layer. So right now I'm carving through, the white is a porcelain slip, and porcelain is just a white clay body, and it's a slip. A slip is just a watered down clay, basically. And so I've painted that. I was able to paint that on the white, and then the brown is a light brown speckled stoneware. So once I paint it on, it's wet, but I let it dry a little bit, and then it's just right for carving through, and I can create any design I want to. I just got a question: how many planters do you make a week? And I really don't have a good answer for that. I have no idea how many I make a week. It really varies depending on what I have going on. Right now, I'm not making nearly as many as I sometimes am, because I've recently am moving into a garage studio. I forgot to welcome you all. This is my garage studio that we are filming out of today. So I've recently moved into this space, so I'm kind of getting up and running and used to working in a new space, and that includes learning to mix some of my own glazes, which I previously used a lot of glazes at a shared studio. So I've been spending a lot of time on glazes recently, actually, and a little bit less time on creating pots. And that's just kind of where I am right now because of the slowdown with all the coronavirus stuff happening. It's actually been a really good time for me to focus on glazing. So I guess there's ebbs and flows depending on what you're working on. But yeah, I don't know exactly how many I make in a week because I used to time myself sometimes and I got kind of sad because it takes a long time to make things. So I usually don't time myself. That's not a very good answer to your question. I'm sorry. I guess I'll have to think about it. But I guess one question is sometimes how long it takes to make something, and that's kind of a tricky question for ceramics. There's almost nothing that I'll make in one sitting. Like I was mentioning, I actually made these pots a few days ago, and then because I wanted to let them sit and get ready before I carve them. And then once I carve them, they still need to dry completely before they're fired. So letting things dry is just kind of a part of ceramics, and that can actually be influenced by things like the weather. So if it happens to be really humid, your clay might dry slower, or if it just happens to be really dry, you might be having to spritz your clay with water to help keep it moist. Of course, there's things you can do if you want to speed up drying. You can put a fan on something or put it out in the sun. So you learn different things. But at the end of the day, it's unavoidable that there's a little bit of time that you're waiting for things to dry before you can fire. And then firing something takes a certain amount of time. So it is a few weeks to make something from start to finish when you put together the fact that you have to create it, let it dry, fire it. So when it comes to designing new products, it takes time because you might have an idea, but it'll be weeks before you actually see it completed and see if you liked it. And sometimes you have to start over. All right, so here's all my leaves carved. And then now I'm gonna remove this kind of sky area, and I like to do that with the bigger loop tool that's often used for trimming pots. So well, thank you all so much for tuning in. If you found me from my Instagram feed, thank you for showing up to see me. If you haven't yet, you also should check out all the other makers taking part in the virtual craft fair. You can head over to the Renegade website and see all the makers taking part. This is kind of a fun way to support artists and makers, since none of us can go to any of our spring craft fairs right now. It's fun to get online and support artists. yeah, and I'm going to be carving for a while, so you're welcome to come and go, and definitely put any questions in if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. I was mentioning earlier that I really love to use natural clay colors in a lot of my work. And by that I just mean I let a lot of the clay be exposed in my work and not without any glaze on it. And I think that it gives kind of that connection to nature and that natural feel. But it also is kind of another color in my palette. If any of you do ceramics, if any of you have tried ceramics before, you might know that glazing is often a really difficult part. I don't know, does anyone feel that way? And I really love using different clays because it gives me some other colors to work with, and they're often pretty reliable colors. Glazes aren't always reliable. Maybe reliable is the wrong word, but sometimes glazes don't look like you think they're going to look in your head. But clay, I find, I just love using different colors. Some people only work with one clay body, which is fine. But I'm just not one of those people. I work with multiple clay bodies. So this obviously is porcelain that we already talked about. This is going to be a light brown speckled clay. I also like to use a dark brown clay, which I can also do this Sgraffito technique on. Those are my main clay bodies right now, but I'm always trying new ones because there are reddish colors, there, there's speckles or no speckles. I don't like to limit myself when it comes to the color of my clay. If you use multiple clay colors, it can be a little tricky in your studio because you don't usually like to get them mixed up. There's a few different things I always do. I always label every clay bag when I open it. And then here on my porcelain slip, I labeled it Cone 5 Porcelain Slip. So I make sure I label everything. That comes from the scientist side of me. My academic background is actually in the sciences, so my note-taking and my labeling, I think, comes from years of working in laboratories. What is your favorite planter design that you make? Let's see. What is my favorite planter design? Right now, I'm having a lot of fun. I've been enjoying what I am calling the ray planter. It is kind of a U-shaped planter. I wish I had one handy to show you, since I'm not sure if you know what I mean. But it is in my online store. I use the dark brown clay, and it's a U-shaped planter. I don't know. I guess it's one of my newer designs, and it's fun when I have something new. So that might be my favorite one right now. I have one of those in my kitchen right now. in my kitchen window with a fern in it. So, so here's my first planter carved. Yeah. Hope y'all enjoyed watching. I'm gonna just keep carving, so I'm gonna go do more of them. So if anyone just tuned in, we're just gonna keep going, keep carving. But here's the first one I finished. But I'm gonna clean up a little bit. It's good to try and keep things a little bit clean, because you don't want to let your clay dust get everywhere. So I'm gonna just, now that I'm done with that one, I'm gonna clean up all these little little bits of clay. I'm just putting them into a bowl of water. As with lots of kinds of dust, it's not healthy to breathe clay dust. So I try and, wipe things down with a wet sponge so that, hopefully I'm keeping my area pretty clean. So let me show you another thing. This is a pot that I just finished. This is one that's completely dry. Just wanted to show you the change in color. So this one is dry and ready to go in the kiln. And you can tell just by looking at it, the color difference. So that's one way to kind of know when it's ready to be fired. But the touch is the really big thing. When I touch this one, it just feels cool and just feels a little moist, a little wet still. And when I feel this one, it no longer has that cool feeling. It's completely dry. This one has been sitting out for days and it's completely dry, so it doesn't feel cool. So that's when I know that this one is ready to be fired. And then once it's fired, it's gonna look like this. So this clay, it's kind of surprising how much it changes after it's fired. But also you can see how much it shrinks. You try and hold them level, but they shrink when they get fired. Pretty crazy. So that's kind of the difference. It's kind of fun to see side by side. I usually forget to do that, so it's kind of nice during a demo to remember to look at the difference. So I'm gonna go back. If you've been watching for a while, I was painting the beginning part of the process. We're going to start over. The beginning part of the process is painting on a porcelain slip onto my pot. I made the pots yesterday. They were ready to go. They're a little bit firm, which is so that they're ready to carve. And I've been painting on a porcelain slip, which is just a watered down clay. And I like to usually paint on 3 layers, but I like to let them dry a little bit between layers because I don't want them to be tacky. Like if I go to pick it up, I don't want it to smush it, but when it dries a little, I can handle it. So these ones needed another layer. And I'm just painting on enough layers so that it's not streaky, visibly streaky anymore. And that's usually 3, but it depends on how thick or thin your slip happens to be. And also just preference. Sometimes you might want it to look streaky, and that can be an artistically cool thing depending on what you're doing. Looks pretty good. I've got a few going here, so I'm going to keep. I usually do work in batches. It's a little funny right now because I'm trying to show you kind of one thing at a time, but I usually work on like a set of something. But I'm just doing a small set for you right now, so it doesn't get too boring. I saw someone who said they didn't know that the planters would shrink so much. I didn't really know when I got started. I didn't really think about it that they would shrink. And another thing that's interesting is different clay bodies will also shrink slightly different amounts. If you go to buy clay from a store, they'll tell you like a percentage that clay is going to shrink. But yeah, it depends. So actually porcelain often shrinks more than other clays. I haven't found that to be an issue on this planter, but it's funny, someone who makes things exclusively in porcelain, that clay body is just known for shrinking a lot, so they'll have to make it quite a bit bigger because by the time it's fired and it shrinks, it gets smaller. They have to make it bigger than they think they need to make it, which is hard too, because when you're first learning clay, it's hard to make bigger things. So I mentioned earlier that I am pretty much exclusively a hand builder. These are slab built pots, not thrown on the wheel. And I think that's partly because I wanted to make bigger things when I was first learning, and I wasn't that good at throwing, and I could only throw like little things, and I wanted to make something big, so I rolled out a slab and I just made something big, and I just sort of got hooked, and I've really enjoyed what I can do with slab building. So maybe someday I'll have to do a video slab building for you all. Alright, so if anyone is just gotten here, these are some pots that I made a few days ago that are ready to carve. And this is my favorite carving tool, a Sgraffito instrument, a little loop tool. And yeah, I'm just demoing my botanical leaf carving. Earlier, I was talking a little bit about the fact that I like to use multiple different clay colors in my work. And here, obviously, I'm using porcelain, a white clay, and this brown clay. This is a speckled clay once it's fired. And I was mentioning that I have a few different ways that I help to keep track of all of that in my studio. And the first thing that I do is that I label all my clay bags whenever I go to open a bag, because I don't want to get confused. But there's a few other things that I do in my studio. I have wear boards. This is just a piece of drywall. So a wear board is just a board that you can put the things you make on, your wares. But I actually keep a light and a dark side to my boards, which is something I came up with that helps from sort of contaminating. If I have something white, I don't really want to get dark clay on it, so I can flip the board, and there's a light side to my board and a dark side to my board. So I can flip it over depending on what I'm working on, and it helps me keep things looking white or dark if I want them to. So, but the other thing I really do to that helps allow me to have different clay colors in my studio is I just like clean up pretty well. When I finish working, I usually wipe down all my tools. So and that's good practice anyway, just for keeping dust down. But by wiping them down regularly, it's okay if I'm going to change clay bodies, because my tools are already pretty clean. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Oh, look. Someone said, how meditative. That's totally how I feel. And that's part of why I thought it was a really good thing for right now. I feel like everyone needs something relaxing to watch. Let's see. How many days did the darker underneath clay need to dry before you put the slip on and can carve it? So days probably isn't necessarily the right word. Usually it's just one day. I usually make the pots on one day and then the next day I get them ready for the slip. It depends a little. When I make a pot, I usually just prefer to let it wait one day. As I mentioned, I'm a slab builder, so when I make a pot, it has a seam where I put the clay. I make a flat piece of clay and I turn it into a cylinder, and so I press it together so it has a seam. And usually whenever I do that, I like to let it sit wrapped in plastic at least overnight, to help kind of let the clay come together and all become the same kind of consistency. And then usually the next day I'll smooth the pot down, I'll put my signature, I'll add the drainage holes if I want to. And then if I'm going to paint on porcelain slip, then I would usually do it that next day. But it depends more on how wet the clay is than by day, like how long it's sat out. I can cover things in plastic if I want to keep them about the same consistency, or if I need them to be drier, I will often put them in under a fan, or set them out in the sun. So when I was working on these pots the other day, I did put them in front of a fan because they were just a little bit too wet. So it really goes by consistency of like feeling your clay. So that's something that just kind of comes with experience and practice. But it does have to do with kind of, you can feel the temperature, and then you can feel kind of how firm the clay is by touching it. So if it's bendy, it's probably a little soft for carving, for my preference. You may have a different preference, but I like it to feel a little bit firm. So I mentioned earlier it should feel kind of, some people describe it as like cheese hard. Like if you imagine like a block of cheddar cheese, it's still moist, but it has some firmness to it. That's kind of a nice time for carving. Or some people say like leather hard, so it may be a little bit harder than a cheese, but still a little bit soft. So those are kind of, you have to think about it more as how that clay feels, and that's just going to depend on how long your clay was sitting out, how hot or dry is it, do you have a fan going. Those things will affect how fast your clay dries out and is ready to carve. Does that make sense? I'm mesmerized, so is my 2-year-old daughter. Oh, thank you for sharing that your daughter enjoys this too. There's an event here in Austin called East Austin Studio Tour, and I have participated in it a few times, and this last year I did this demo carving the botanical leaf planters. It's a nice demo to be able to take with me somewhere because it doesn't take up a lot of room. And there was multiple kids that would come up and stare at me while I was doing this, and it's really fun. It's really fun that kids like to watch it too. So I'm glad you all are enjoying. There's something really satisfying about it. I think just the color difference of the light and the dark, seeing it get peeled away, I think that's what makes it satisfying. when I carve just into dark clay, it's not quite as satisfying as watching the color difference. One time I missed a leaf and it went all the way and got fired, and it wasn't until it got out of the kiln that I saw I had missed a few lines. Those usually end up being the pots that I keep for myself. It's funny. So, since I'm a little more distracted than usual doing the live feed, I'll have to check these all later and make sure I did them. Got all the lines carved. Oh, thank you. Someone said they look cool just half carved also. They do. They do look cool both ways. I've done a few different designs, but I always come back to this one. It's just probably my favorite of the carved designs. But I do often experiment with other plants. So I have messed up before. Sometimes it doesn't matter, like if I accidentally carve into like the sky area, it doesn't matter because I can just carve it away. Sometimes if I make a mistake, I can kind of use the back of my nail